we have explained the importance of awakening the consciousness. What can this do for us? Can we have the power to create the kind of life we want? Yes. However, transformation of our life begins with something fundamental: transformation of impressions.
Is it possible to transform our lives? How? What are the advantages of this transformation?
We need to comprehend that the important thing for us is to achieve the transformation of our lives. And this is only possible if we propose to do it deeply. Transformation means that something turns into something else. There are well-known transformations of matter. For example, sugar transforms itself into alcohol. In this transformation, a molecular substance becomes another molecular substance. The alchemists of the Middle Ages talked about the transmutation of lead into gold. They usually meant the transmutation of the lead of personality into the gold of the spirit. In the Gospels, the idea of the earthly man compared to a seed which can grow has the same meaning. Nevertheless, it is obvious that if the grain does not die, the plant is not born. In every transformation, there is death and birth, or death and resurrection. Man is a machine which can transform certain nourishment which comes to him in order to subsist. There are three sorts of nourishment which penetrate the organism. We can call the first one food. If it were not for the stomach, the transformation of the first sort of nourishment would not be possible. There are people who can live for some time without any food. Then, this is not the most important nourishment. The second sort of nourishment is the prana, which enters our physical body along with oxygen. And unquestionably, we have a special organ or organs to transform the nourishment which comes in through the nose. Breathing is more important than the food we eat. We would be able to live nearly 1 month without eating, but we would not be able to hold our breath for a long time. And finally, there is a third sort of nourishment which is, in fact, still more important. I want to refer in an emphatic way to the impressions. Unquestionably, we would not be able to remain alive for a single second if the impressions did not exist. What is an impression? Whatever we can perceive, any image, sound, smell, sensation, taste, stimulus, etc., is an impression. We perceive the outer world which surrounds us by means of the diverse impressions that penetrate us through the senses. So the impressions are fundamental. Unfortunately, what happens with the food we eat and the air we breathe does not happen with the impressions we receive. There is no organ to digest and transform the impressions. When we eat food, it is transformed into all the vital elements that we need to live. If some food, for instance, went through the stomach and were not transformed, that would just be indigestion. But why doesn't a transformation of impressions exist too? For nature's purpose, it is not necessary that the intellectual animal transforms his impressions. Nevertheless, if we want to stop being simple intellectual animals and become real men, we must learn how to transform impressions.
Why is it important to work with impressions in order to change our life? Is it not true that we will evolve due to the growth that happens in nature anyway?
The intellectual animal wants to stop suffering, but he does nothing to change. He does not fight to pass to a higher level of the being. How can he change then? all phenomena are discontinuous. The dogma of evolution is good for nothing. It can only bring us to a standstill. In practical life, most people believe that this physical world will give them what they want. And there you have, my dear friends, a tremendous mistake. The concept of an external life does not really exist. What we're saying is quite revolutionary, for everybody believes that the physical world is the real one. But if we go a little deeper, we shall realize that what we're perceiving at every instant are mere impressions. Life is a succession of impressions, and not a solid, physical, and exclusively material thing as many learned ignoramuses believe. The reality of life for us is its impressions. You may believe that the life you live exists as such and not as its impressions. People do think in that way because they are so influenced by the physical world. But if we meditate deeply on all that we see, we come to the conclusion that the impressions are the real thing. As I already said, they come to the mind through the windows of the five senses. If, for example, we had no eyes to see, nor ears to hear, nor fingers to touch, nor a nose to smell, nor even a tongue to taste the food which comes into our organism, would the so-called physical world exist to us? Of course not. All events of life come to the mind as impressions. All circumstances come to the brain as impressions. Happiness, sadness, hope, desperation, problems, worries, etc. come to the mind as impressions. Any circumstance, any event, no matter how insignificant it might be, always comes to the mind as impressions. Therefore, it is critical to work with impressions.
It is starting to make sense, but there are still some doubts. What would happen if we do not transform our impressions? What are the consequences?
Unfortunately, since we do not have an organ able to transform or digest impressions, they become psychic aggregates, that is to say, eyes. If we do not transform a bad impression we receive, for example, from an insulter, then that impression becomes an eye of revenge inside us. If we do not transform the impression made on us by a person of the opposite sex, it will unquestionably become an eye of lust. Imagine, for instance, a man who sees a provocative woman and does not transform those impressions. As a result, they will make him want to possess her. This wish is the mechanical result of the impression received, and it crystallizes in the psyche as an inhuman element, a new lustful I, which joins the whole of the already existing inhuman elements that make up the ego, the myself, oneself. Within us, there is anger, greed, lust, envy, pride, laziness, and gluttony. Greed, undoubtedly. Many things aroused greed in us. Money, jewels, all sorts of material things, etc. These objects came to us as impressions. We made the mistake of not transforming those impressions into different things. Admiration for beauty, or altruism, or happiness, for our neighbor's good luck, etc. It is obvious that such non-transformed impressions turned into eyes of greed, which we bear inside us now. Therefore, now we have to work on the impressions we have inside us and on their mechanical results. Lots of noisy and quarrelsome eyes that we need to comprehend and eliminate now. The results of this non-transformation of impressions at an individual level also gets manifested in our interaction with others and are now visible all over the society. If you look around us, what do you see? People have become wicked, distrustful, suspicious, shrewd and malicious. Nobody believes in anybody anymore. No job brings happiness. The sense of real love is lost. And people get married today and divorced tomorrow. Family unity is regrettably lost. Organic shame does not exist anymore. This is the cause of so much corruption.
Now I can understand the problems that are created if we do not transform the impressions we receive in each moment. Then can you please tell us the way to transform the impressions?
As we have seen, the non-transformation of impressions means creating new eyes. We have not only the eyes we possess, the ones we bring from previous existences, but worst of all, we are creating new eyes every day. And that is regrettable. It is indispensable to stop creating new eyes. That is only possible if we digest and transform the impressions. And how can we digest them? How can we transform them into something different? By means of the consciousness. If we interpose what we call consciousness between the impressions and the mind, the impressions are transformed. Usually, the impressions hurt the mind, and then the mind reacts against the impact coming from the outer world. If we are hit, we hit. We must avoid such a reaction, and that would only be possible by interposing the consciousness between the mind and the impressions. How can we interpose consciousness between the impressions and the mind? How can we ensure that the consciousness receives the impressions and not the mind? It is very simple. We must never forget ourselves, our own being. If you forget your own inner being in front of an insulter, you end up insulting. If you forget yourself, your own being in front of a person of the opposite sex, you end up fornicating. When you learn to live in a state of alert perception, of alert for novelty, when you remember yourself from instant to instant, when you never forget yourself, you undoubtedly become more and more conscious. So, not forgetting oneself is the key which enables us to handle the consciousness in an intelligent way. When you do not forget yourself, you interpose between the mind and the impressions what we call consciousness. It is wonderful when the consciousness receives the impressions coming from the outer world, because the consciousness can transform them into something different, into creative elements, into superlative elements of the being, into diamantine forces, which are useful to unfold the chakras, into multiple forces, which are useful to unlock certain powers that exist in our inner constitution. Unfortunately, people never remember themselves. That is why the impressions come to our mind and remain in that way without any transformation at all, producing, of course, psychic aggregates, eyes. Then it is necessary to know that all the eyes we have at present are the result of non-digested or non-transformed impressions. And this is regrettable. Somebody might afford to dissolve all the old eyes, but if they forget themselves, they create new eyes again. The whole problem of liberation is based on transformation, and the basis of transformation is sacrifice. You must not forget yourself. Do not forget your own being. In that way, you will strengthen the longing to reach Him. It is necessary that we become more reflective. If a man is desperate due to a sentimental, economic, or political problem, he has obviously forgotten himself. If such a person stops for an instant, if he observes a situation and tries to remember himself, and then makes an effort to comprehend the sense of his attitudes, if he reflects a little on what is going on, if he thinks that everything passes, that life is illusory and fleeting, and that death reduces to ashes all the vanities of the world, if he comprehends that his problems are, deep down, just a will-o'-the-wisp, an outburst, he will suddenly see in amazement that everything has changed. Transforming mechanical reactions is possible by means of the logical comparison and the intimate self-reflection of the being. What is this thing we call life, really? Certainly it is like a film. Indeed, when the time to die comes, we go back to the beginning of that film and take it to eternity. When we return, when we come back with the egos, we bring our film too. When you are restructured with a new organism, you project your film on the screen of existence again. And what do you project? Your life? Which one? The same old one. The same one you had in your previous existence. In fact, everything you project has been programmed into your brain from your birth. Therefore, we are programmed robots. Then, what is this sorrowful existence we are leading? Sheer illusion? Something vain? With good reason, the Hindus say that this world is just Maya, that the world is illusory, that it has no value. We need to have a real existence, for we have not got it yet. But in order to have it, we need to stop being robots, and we can do so by eliminating all psychic aggregates. That is obvious. However, knowing that we must eliminate the psychic aggregates is not enough. We need to stop creating new aggregates. We need to digest impressions, to transform them into different forces so that we do not create new eyes. We also need to transform the old impressions, the ones which produce the eyes we have at present. And that is only possible through self-reflection.
I understand the importance of transforming the impressions as well as the procedure to do so each moment. What starts to happen as we start transforming our impressions?
We want our patient listeners to know that we also call this important matter regarding the transformation of impressions the first conscious shock. Why do we call the work on the transformation of impressions the first conscious shock? Due to a single reason. It is something that we would never be able to do in a merely mechanical way. A self-conscious effort is needed. It is clear that an aspirant who starts comprehending this sort of work obviously begins to stop being a mechanical person too. If you start to comprehend now the meaning of all that we are teaching here, if you now think of the meaning of self-observation, you will undoubtedly realize that the practical side of the esoteric work is wholly related to the transformation of impressions and to what comes out of them, of course. The work, for instance, on the negative emotions, the wrathful moods, the identification, the self-consideration, the successive eyes, is wholly related to the transformation of impressions and what comes out of them. I want you to reflect profoundly on this. It is necessary to form an instrument of change in the place where the impressions enter. Do not forget this. If by comprehending all this you can accept life as a real esoteric work, you will consequently be in a constant state of self-remembering. This state of self-consciousness will enable you to transform your impressions in a real way and, of course, to have a different life. All of you will start thinking and comprehending things in a different way. And this will be the beginning of your own transformation. As long as you keep on thinking in the same old way, taking life in the same old way, it is clear that there will be no change in you. Transforming the impressions of life means transforming oneself, and only a totally new way of thinking can accomplish it. All this work is aimed at producing a radical transformation. If you do not transform yourselves, you achieve nothing. It is easy to comprehend that life compels us to react continuously. All those reactions make up our personal lives. Changing one's own life is not changing the merely external circumstances, but changing the very reactions. If most of the reactions which make up our personal life are negative, then our life will be negative as well. Therefore, we must transform life's impressions so that they do not produce the negative reactions we are so used to. But in order to attain that, it is necessary to observe ourselves from instant to instant, from moment to moment.
Absolutely. In fact, you have given us a key to transform our lives radically. How easy or difficult would it be for us to use this key, to apply it in our daily life?
If you throw a ball to a wall, the wall receives the impression and a reaction comes, which is the mechanical return of the ball to the person who threw it. All impressions are received like this when we are not conscious. There are some impressions which are not very pleasant. For instance, a slanderer's or an insulter's words. But if you are able to transform the impressions that such words produce on you, they are worthless. When you comprehend this, you transform those impressions into something different, into love, into compassion, into tolerance for the insulter, etc. Therefore, we need to be transforming impressions unceasingly, not only the present ones, but also the past ones. For instance, if the image of a lustful woman comes to the mind, or appears in it, we could transform that lustful impression through comprehension. If we remembered for a moment that such a woman will die, and that her body will be reduced to ashes in the graveyard, if we used our imagination to see her disintegrated body inside the tomb, that would be quite enough to transform the lustful impression into chastity. Then, by transforming such impressions, gradually, no more lustful eyes would appear inside our psyche. If someone praises us, for example, how would we transform that vanity that such a flatterer might produce in us? Through comprehension. When you really comprehend that you are just an infinitesimal creature in the entire universe, we already know that our planet Earth is a speck of sand in space. Let's think of the galaxy where we live, consisting of millions of worlds. What is the Earth? It is a miserable particle of dust in that infinite. What about us? Microorganisms inside that particle. So what? Naturally, my friends, these reflections enable us to transform the impressions connected to flattery, adulation, or praise, so that we do not end up reacting with vanity or pride. Therefore, the more we reflect on all this, the more we see the need to transform impressions completely. Everything which comes to us from the world is eventually just an internal impression. So, if we do not work on what is internal, we go along the wrong way, and we shall never modify our lives. If we want to be different, we need to transform ourselves completely. And if we want to transform ourselves completely, we must begin by transforming our impressions. There you have the key to transform the individual radically.